The media shows you this. A successful test of Turkey's new Sipir-1 missile defense system. A kinetic spectacle designed for television. This is a deliberate misdirection. The legacy-era obsession with missile capabilities is a strategic illusion, focusing your attention on the explosion while ignoring the trigger. The real vector for systemic conflict is not kinetic. It is silent. Analysts at CSIS confirm the primary vulnerability of Western hegemony is the global network of undersea fiber optic cables. These are not just data lines. They are the circulatory system of the entire global financial order. Fragile, unprotected. A new way of warfare, as outlined by War on the Rocks, prioritizes systemic disruption over physical destruction. Severing a handful of these cables, particularly in choke points like the Luzon Strait or the Red Sea, does not create an explosion. It creates a digital blackout, a global liquidity event, a solvency crisis triggered by silence. This leads to the creation of the blind Leviathan, a hegemon stripped of its satellite intelligence and real-time data feeds does not become passive. It becomes paranoid. Unable to differentiate threats, its response protocol shifts from precision strikes to disproportionate area denial attacks. Every unverified signal becomes a potential nuclear precursor. When the US can no longer trust its screens, it loses narrative control and escalatory dominance. It becomes a cornered power, incentivized to use overwhelming force preemptively. The cost of being wrong is lower than the cost of being slow. This is the mathematical certainty of the silent vector. An asymmetric attack on data infrastructure creates a predictable pathway to a kinetic and potentially nuclear solvency crisis. State-level conflict is no longer a function of ideology. It is a function of accounting. The kinetic event in Ukraine must be reframed not as a war of expansion, but as the forced liquidation of a domestic liability. CSIS analysis, corroborating earlier reports from Forbes, confirms this framework. The conventional war became a terminal domestic liability for the Kremlin, a drain on capital and political stability. When the kinetic cost of a symmetric ground war exceeds a state's solvency threshold, the objective pivots from military victory to economic survival. This is the blueprint for a solvency crisis. This weakness forces a pivot to asymmetry. Unable to sustain a conventional war against a Western-backed opponent, the state must weaponize other vectors. Energy becomes leverage. Grain exports become a negotiating tool. This isn't chaos. It is a calculated response to economic reality, a new way of warfare that prioritizes systemic disruption over territorial gain. This protocol is not isolated. As global capital flees German bonds, shattering the illusion of EU fiscal solvency, mid-level actors are activated. Turkey's successful test of its indigenous Sipir-1 long-range missile system is not a defense story. It is a declaration of strategic independence, a new node of asymmetric power created by the hegemon's contracting influence. The declining hegemon's response to this decentralization becomes mathematically predictable, erratic and disproportionate. The playbook, seen in covert actions against states like Venezuela, shifts from stable deterrence to preemption. When a state can no longer afford its own liabilities, it is forced to export the crisis. The motive is solvency. The vector is conflict. The kinetic cost of neutralizing a primary battle asset has collapsed. Analysis from RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, confirms the new battlefield equation. A $5 million main battle tank can now be terminated by a $500 FPV drone. This is not an incremental change. It is a 10,000 to 1 asymmetric cost advantage, a fundamental repricing of lethality. This phenomenon is termed the democratization of violence. The financial barrier to entry for projecting strategic kinetic force has been effectively erased. This economic reality mathematically incentivizes mid-level state actors to challenge conventionally superior adversaries, imposing disproportionate costs and creating strategic paralysis. This is the vector through which localized disputes escalate into a systemic, global solvency crisis. The global chessboard is being redefined not by declarations of war, but in designated gray zones. These are not random flare-ups of instability. They are proxy laboratories. Reports of instability, whether a travel warning for Canada or social fragmentation in South Africa, are symptoms, diagnostic data points indicating a systemic failure. They are the staging grounds where new protocols for asymmetric warfare are tested before deployment on a primary target. This new battle space exists because the traditional anchors of Western power are becoming liabilities. Consider the German fiscal illusion. Capital is fleeing German bunds, with risk spreads against Italian and Spanish sovereign bonds shrinking to historic lows. This is not market noise. It is a mathematical repricing of German solvency. According to bond market data, the economic engine of Europe is now perceived as an unstable platform. This economic vacuum creates kinetic opportunity. Mid-level state actors now have the incentive to build leverage outside the NATO framework. Turkey's successful test of its Cyper-1 long-range air defense system is a primary exhibit. This is not merely a new piece of hardware. It is a declaration of strategic independence, reducing reliance on the hegemon and creating an asymmetric military reality. It is a direct consequence of the perceived decay at the system's core. As its conventional dominance erodes, the hegemon's response protocol becomes erratic. CSI's and USI analysis has long warned that a declining power resorts to disproportionate action. The alleged U.S. plan to abduct a foreign head of state in Venezuela is a data point, not an anomaly. It demonstrates a shift from strategic statecraft to high-risk, low-yield kinetic gambles. This is the predictable behavior of a system losing control. These gray zones are where the new doctrines of warfare, as detailed by outlets like War on the Rocks, are being refined. Economic coercion, narrative degradation, and limited kinetic strikes are tested for efficacy. The goal is to perfect a blueprint for systemic disruption at a low initial cost, before the solvency crisis in the core converges with a geopolitical miscalculation, triggering a launch-on-warning scenario for the entire global financial system. The doctrine is called launch-on-warning. It is not a strategy. It is a pre-authorized, automated response protocol. When early warning systems detect an incoming nuclear strike, the protocol mandates an immediate, retaliatory launch. The objective is to ensure a second strike capability before your own silos are turned into glass. It is a mathematical equation designed to make a first strike logically untenable. The entire system is predicated on one fragile assumption, that the warning signal is accurate. This brings us to the primary vector for systemic escalation, the fog of digital war. As analysts at CSIS have warned, a sophisticated cyber attack does not need to kinetically destroy a radar installation. It only needs to blind it, or worse, inject false positives. The commander on duty is suddenly information insolvent. The data stream, their most valuable asset, is now a liability. They cannot distinguish a sensor glitch from an inbound decapitation strike. The commander now faces a binary solvency crisis. Option 1. Wait for confirmation. If the attack is real, the cost is total national annihilation. The kinetic debt is unpayable. Option 2. Adhere to the launch-on-warning protocol based on compromised data. This is the calculated, safe option. The fear of inaction, driven by digital blindness, forces the launch. This is how an asymmetric cyber attack bypasses trillions in conventional defenses and forces a nuclear-level response. It's not a failure of courage. It is the final, logical outcome of a system that has lost control. The repricing of risk is the first signal. Capital is not shifting out of German bunds into Italian and Spanish paper. It is executing a controlled demolition of Europe's fiscal anchor. Bond markets are signaling a terminal diagnosis for German solvency. This is the primary accelerant, creating the mathematical conditions for a power vacuum. This economic liability is mirrored by a kinetic shift. While Western analysts debate cohesion, mid-level state actors are achieving strategic autonomy. The acceptance test of Turkey's Cyper-1 long-range missile defense system, confirmed at the Sinop Test Center, is not a procurement detail. It is the acquisition of asymmetric leverage, fundamentally altering the calculus of power projection in the region. As the established hegemon's conventional dominance erodes, its response to such challenges becomes disproportionate, a pattern documented by RUSI. This dynamic incentivizes a calibration shot, an attribution impossible event to test the hegemon's response protocol and expose its systemic fragility. Within the next 10 months, anticipate a multi-vector cyber-physical attack on the port of Rotterdam. It will manifest as a simultaneous failure of crane automation systems, shipping lane navigation, and data infrastructure. The event will be attributed to a cascading software update failure and a coincidental undersea cable disruption. It will not be an act of war. It will be a solvency test executed at machine speed.